and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today I am bringing you with me to New Orleans. I went to a trip there recently, actually to see Taylor Swift in concert. I didn't understand how verified fan worked back when tickets went on sale for Seattle, so I completely missed my shot there. But we were lucky enough to score some tickets in New Orleans. So in this video, we are not just focused on the concert. I also, as always, went to a lot of museums, graveyards, all that good stuff. So I'm going to take you along with me for those. I also went to a fabric store. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into the footage. We are headed this morning to Café du Monde, but we have to go through Jackson Square to get there. It was quite empty and really beautiful out, very sunny. And Jackson Square is always a really pretty location to just kind of walk around and look at the buildings and look at the church and all of that good stuff. While waiting in the line for Café du Monde, we saw this really funny beignet Taylor Swift drawing that was really cute. There were just a lot of really fun things here for the Taylor Swift weekend in New Orleans. And it took a while, but we did finally get to the front of the line and have our beignets. After that, we walked back to where we're staying, but we decided to go through the French Quarter and down Bourbon Street. I always really enjoy seeing all the ironwork in New Orleans. It's really, really beautiful. There's just so many stunning buildings. And Bourbon Street felt very, very busy with trucks this morning. I'm sure it was everybody dropping off all their shipments to prepare for the Taylor Swift event and the Halloween, and just New Orleans being incredibly crowded. And later that day, I headed to Promenade Fabrics, which is a fabric shop in New Orleans. They had really, really, really cool fabric here. This was a really fun store to look around in. They had a lot of like unique things that I don't see everywhere, but they also had a lot of great like base things like linen and cottons that were really nice, high quality, and I felt like their prices overall were about on par with what things cost. When you buy fabric, I was here primarily for this very specific ribbon. They had bought some of, I forget the name of the New York place that went out of business, but they bought some of their stock, which I always, if I am in a place where the store bought that stock, I am at that store. On their table of like inspiration stuff for you to look at, they had all of these beautiful Modes and Trevo catalogs, which I took a quick pass through, but I only had so much time here, so I had to stay focused. Otherwise, I could have browsed these for hours. Every bar, it felt like, had its own like Taylor Swift inspired menu. This one, of course, though, was also over the top with these decorations. Like, just the number of signs for it is wild to me. Our next stop for the day was at the Pharmacy Museum in New Orleans. While there was a focus on pharmacy in this museum, there was also just a lot of really interesting medical devices here. I read a lot, I learned a lot, I got the ick a lot. It was really, really interesting. And I thoroughly enjoyed just like how many different bottles and like vintage, basically pharmaceutical goods they had here. It was fun to read these bottles, read these packagings, read their claims, read what was in them. Definitely really fascinating, also a little alarming. Apparently, rich people like to take their pills in precious metals, which was wild to me and also like not good for your health. This was a really fascinating museum. I highly recommend going to it. While it's pretty small and today was really crowded, I felt like they talked a lot about different medical things, and they also talked about like the origins of pharmacy because the first licensed pharmacist was in New Orleans, and they talked a lot about kind of the relationship between like alchemy and pharmacy. And also I felt like they did overall a really great job also covering the medical history of specifically like midwives and the way kind of like licensing doctors was to shove midwives out of the industry, even though male doctors would have higher death rates. And I think all of that is really, really fascinating, and I just thought this was so well done. They also talked about the origin of having a soda fountain at a pharmacy, how a soda fountain might be a way that they would dispense of like kind of more herbal or tea-based remedies in like a soda. So I thought that was really interesting. And they had this whole pharmacy set up back here, which is where pharmacists would make stuff, and they would do it back here so that way like customers wouldn't see them. Like they wanted to keep some kind of mysticism about pharmacy, which was really fascinating. There was also this back courtyard that they talked about growing herbs and trees and different things that you can use in medicine back here. And they also had a really interesting and thorough exhibit about the history of Black people in pharmacy, which was really, really fascinating and a great read. And one of the things that I definitely noted was in 1927, the Black Pharmacy College in New Orleans graduated women in that first class. And that just was really cool to me. I so enjoyed this exhibit and learning so much about the history of basically racism in pharmacy and how they intersected that I actually picked up a book. I'll link it down below if I can find it online, but they had a book written by the same person who really helped with this exhibit. We took a really long time in here reading everything, so we basically closed the place down so we got to enjoy the downstairs being a lot more empty. I wanted to do a little bit of filming of Canal Street, which is what we're crossing here. Canal Street is huge. This is a really, really big road, and the crosswalks were kind of confusing. And we went out to eat on Bourbon Street that night, and we had a rooftop view around sunset, which was really pretty. And it's always fun to be able to look down on Bourbon Street. The next thing we did was a ghost tour. We kind of stopped at most of the usual places, this being the exception. This was a hotel where the man who owned it killed himself, and then they have a place set up for him at a restaurant. So really interesting. I remember going on one of these ghost tours as a kid, and we did all the same stops, I think, except for this one. And then, of course, we made the stop at the Ursuline Covenant, which is where a lot of the vampire lore from New Orleans. You just look up the name of this, you'll get all the lore associated with it. I'm not going to tell the story here. And then, of course, it's not a ghost tour in New Orleans unless you stop Lorelei Mansion, which again, you can look it up if you want to know the lore about that. While they could be said to be kind of hokey, I always recommend doing ghost tours in New Orleans. I think they're a lot of fun, but that is all we did for the day. And then for the next morning, we are headed out of New Orleans for a swamp tour. I'm quite excited. I have never been on a swamp tour, so I've really been looking forward to this. As part of this, we went by a drive-through for daiquiris. Yes, you can drive through and buy alcohol in New Orleans, which is wild to me. I am a huge fan of open container and being able to drink when you walk around, but I don't know about being able to drive through and get alcohol. And once we got to the swamp, we got in our boats and started heading down the swamp to go see some alligators and other wildlife. This one here is our first alligator sighting, and also I think the largest we saw. We also went down by all these camps. These camps kind of made me think about cabin culture in Colorado, where I grew up, except for, of course, cabins were a lot easier to build because you didn't have to drag all your materials on to the river and build it from there. A lot of these, it seems have electricity, but apparently they're mostly really, really, I was gonna say homemade, which technically all houses are built by hands, but the way these are built is just really, really different, and I thought was really fascinating. If you get the opportunity to go on a tour like this, I highly recommend. But also there's a lot of really interesting YouTube videos out there about camp culture in the swamps of Louisiana. So if this interests you and you actually want details about it, go look those up. I was trying to understand how the land rights and rights of these homes work, because they are property and they are sitting on land, but I couldn't really get a clear answer from my tour guide. He said that sometimes they permit, sometimes they just show up. It was interesting. It seems like it varies, but if you know anything about this type of camp culture and understand how the land rights work, I would be so curious to know. Just to me, it seems not very like the United States of America to have a place that you can just build a house and exist on. Usually it seems like money has to change hands to do that in the States, so if this is an area that's not the case, that's really, really cool, but I definitely was left semi-mystified on how exactly these worked. But after that, we kind of headed off the main, this isn't even a river, but the main area into the smaller little streams in the swamp. As you can see, it's a lot tighter in here and there is really, really dense vegetation, but it's really, really beautiful. Much to my dismay, I was on the wrong side of the boat to see the gators, so my footage is going to be terrible. But you do get to see this raccoon scare some gators back into the water. The raccoons were so cute here. Not nearly as scary as the ones from the Pacific Northwest because they were a lot tinier. Here's a little gator in the water. The gators in here are really quite tiny, but I think like the smaller the body of water, the smaller the gator. And here's another little raccoon, so precious. And here is kind of a cool little bird. So the raccoons actually follow us because this boat does feed them marshmallows. It's very cute and very entertaining, but I also wish they wouldn't. I am not a fan of feeding wildlife. I know as far as feeding wildlife goes, marshmallows to raccoons are relatively harmless. And from all of my reading and researching, one of the reasons I chose this swamp tour is because at the very least they don't feed the gators. Our guide did wrangle a snake though, which was a little scary. I will say the landscape here was so cool. I've just never really experienced an area like this, and again, I think it's one of the funnest things about traveling America is not only are there so many different cultural things, but there's also so many different biomes and like nature experiences, and I think that's really, really cool. You can see here the raccoons are still following us, hunting for those marshmallows. At this point, I was like afraid they were gonna hop in the boat. But they are really cute. And yeah, again, I wish they wouldn't feed them marshmallows because also I didn't really super enjoy getting chased by raccoons this whole tour. But I get it. I get that you want to see animals when you go on these, and this tour is trying to compete with tours that, like I said, actually physically handle the gators. So I will cut them some slack. Like, I think they're probably one of the most responsible tours out there as far as this goes. And I thought our guide was really knowledgeable, and it was clear he loved the swamp and like really grew up in the swamp. And I always think that's something that you want to try to find in a guide is you want to try to find guides who are actually like local to the area and like love what they're showing. And this person clearly loved the swamp and everything about it. Our guide did spend a lot of time talking through what is impacting the swamps in a really negative way, such as invasive species like I think they're apple snails, and then wild hogs digging up all the vegetation. He showed us spots where you could see that happening. He showed us the snail eggs and the snail shells. They did do a good job, I feel like, trying to give you like some education around what is endangering the swamps and how to protect them, which I do think is really important anytime you do a tour that's kind of more ecology based. Here's another little gator hanging out. And we did get to see some hogs and little hog babies. There was another boat in the way, as you just saw, but you can see I'm trying to capture them, but I'm not very good at filming animals. I didn't mind that we spent more time looking at gators than hogs because I find wild hogs to be kind of scary. Here's another blue heron just chilling. Here's another gator chilling. They're kind of funny how much they like sit on those logs. We have a gator and a turtle. We also did see a lot of turtles on this tour. And then we headed back up the river. Here you can see some of those like big, more expensive houses out here. We're pretty close to back where we launched, although we're going to go past it. But they did call out that these two houses are some of the oldest camps that are on this part of the river, which is always really interesting. And they are so much smaller than the other camps we saw further down. And apparently one guy still comes out here every once in a while to fish, and he's the one who owns one of those houses. And then here we're in a different type of swamp. I can't quite remember the difference between the two, but you can see like the water line on these trees, and it's like a lot less vegetation and a lot less dense. There's just a lot more water in between these trees, and it was also really, really stunning. You can see a bird here in this footage if you look really closely. There was just so much wildlife here, and it was really cool to see everything we saw. And again, I really like the tour guide, and I definitely think this tour is the way to go. And we got to see these weird little fish that just stick their mouths out of the water when they're like swimming along. But that is it for our swamp tour today. Now we're gonna head back to New Orleans, and I'll still be plenty busy. I met up with a friend, and we just kind of walked around the French Quarter and enjoyed the architecture and talked. And I also had one of those daiquiris that you can get and just walk around with. I will say I don't know that I would do it again. I probably would just get a normal drink from a bar, but I was glad to have tried the daiquiri. I did stop into one vintage store later that day, and it was beautifully curated. I just am not in the market for vintage clothing much right now, especially after the money I spent at the fabric store. If you've been on my channel at all or seen any of my videos, you know my favorite way to enjoy a city is just to walk around block for block, which is what we did here, and we saw all sorts of really, again, beautiful architecture and ironwork and Halloween decorations, and it was just really, really fun. And it was fun to meet up with a friend who actually lives in Seattle to, because it's just always fun to kind of spend time with people you know in new places. It was also fun to get a little bit off the main drag with my family. I spent most of my time in the main part of the French Quarter and Bourbon Street, so it was good to get to see some other parts, especially while it was a little quieter. But we did pass the famous Fern Corner. And that is it for today. And it is the morning of the concert. We have a pretty low-key day planned today with just visiting the St. Louis Cemetery number 1, which is the oldest cemetery in New Orleans and uses vault-style burial. You have to book a tour to go to the cemetery. You can't go into the cemetery without a tour because it is still, I believe, owned by the Catholic Church. So you have to book a tour to get in here. However, it was really, really fascinating. I do think you can get into other cemeteries for free. So if you don't care much for tours, you can totally do that. But this one is so dense and so tightly packed. And it was really interesting learning about how bodies are buried using vaults like this and how they're kind of like rotated through to get the body to break down and become bone, where then they can just kind of settle them in the bottom of the vaults and kind of start over. It was really, really fascinating. And this cemetery, home to some interesting people as well. Infamously, Nicolas Cage bribed the church in some way, shape, or form to get to be buried here in this ugly pyramid that he built. And then there are also like these group vaults and things like that. I think there's only one still active group vault in the cemetery. This is still an active cemetery that people are buried in. I think he said it's somewhere between like 10 and 20 a year. So not a ton of people being buried here still, because you have to have like a pretty big family history to be able to be buried in this cemetery, because it's very small and very full. This cemetery overall was super, super pretty. Although I will say on a hot day, it is really warm in here, because unlike other cemeteries, there is not just tons of trees and shade. One of the historical figures of note buried in this graveyard is Homer Plessy of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy sued to end segregation. He unfortunately was not successful, and it only cemented segregation into our Constitution, but it's always really important to remember people who push forward things to try to fight for a fairer world, even if they aren't successful. And then another important historical figure buried here is Marie Laveau. Marie Laveau is most famous in pop culture as being a voodoo priestess and is depicted in American Horror Story. It does a big disservice to her, though, to think of her as that role. She was a prominent figure in her community, a healer, and yes, a voodoo priestess, which is important. And also it's important to note that she was considered an upstanding member of the Catholic Church. That's the only way she was allowed to be buried here. She served her community with both healing as well as settling disputes and just other community-oriented things. A lot of the stuff around her is actually very lore. There is a lot less known about her voodoo practice when it comes to historically accurate, but she did do a lot of services with her community, and all that said, she was still also a complicated figure because she is documented to have owned slaves. So she's a very, very complex and rich historical figure, and I actually really recommend going into a rabbit hole and reading about her because she's really fascinating. Her tomb is often vandalized due to various lore around her granting wishes, which is really disappointing. I know that lore and especially lore around witchcraft and voodoo is really fun, but vandalizing somebody's resting place is not appropriate. And it's important to remember that voodoo is still a practiced and respected religion, and we should be respectful about their figures as you would ask people to be respectful of the figures of your religious beliefs. And then after the cemetery tour, we walked back into the French Quarter and just kind of saw some different architecture. Look at this beautiful little fern set up with the spiders for Halloween. But we're mostly headed back to the hotel to prepare for the show. Before the show, though, my sister and I wanted to go to the Affogato place. I am a huge fan of affogatos, and this one has all these really cool specialty ones. This was, I can't remember the flavor, but it's like their cherry-themed one. And an affogato is espresso and ice cream, and we felt like it was the perfect thing to get us ready for the concert. So we got this one here, and then a Bananas Foster one later because we decided one was not enough. And the place itself was just really, really cool. I really enjoyed being in here. We did finally make it to the concert. This was wild. I have not really experienced anything like this in my life. And finally, after a year of waiting, the concert began. I was so excited. So I will say I have a very complex relationship with Taylor Swift. I have just a lot of feelings about Taylor Swift, the person, the billionaire, and all of that. But that said, her first album was the first album I ever bought with my own money. It was the first music I experienced outside of kind of the like Christian kid bubble I was in. And then with every album she put out, it very much like spoke true to like the heartache and friendships and different things I was experiencing in life. So I've just always felt a really deep connection to her music. So I was really excited to be here for the Eras concert. I will say, like, if you didn't make it to the Eras tour and you feel bummed about it, you'll be okay. Like, having been to her Reputation concert, all of her concerts are essentially Eras concerts. She sang different songs from every era at the Reputation concert as well. Of course, you know that was like a gajillion eras ago. I did thoroughly enjoy this concert. I enjoyed the atmosphere. Well, to some extent, I will say, I think a lot of people don't know concert etiquette anymore. There was a lot of people blocking views with outfits. I had earplugs in. I highly recommend going to concerts like this with earplugs in so you hear the artist and not the crowd. But that said, even with my earplugs in, I could hear the scream singer behind me, and I'm so fascinated by this. If you do this, I was gonna say I'm not judging you, but I am judging you a little. But I noticed there were a lot of people filming themselves singing to the concert music on their phones. And I just found that really fascinating because I can film myself singing Taylor Swift any day of the week, but I can't film Taylor Swift singing Taylor Swift with all her concert and her lights and stuff like that. And even here where you see I have filmed, despite the fact I've filmed this concert, which by the way, I haven't put an audio in because Taylor Swift is notorious for coming after copyright and I don't understand the rules around that when it comes to concert. That said, I so much would rather go back and watch videos of the concert I've been to. Like, I go back and watch my Reputation videos every few years. And like, that's really what I want to watch. I can't imagine wanting to watch myself sing all of the music. So I am curious and trying to keep all of my judgment out. But if you are somebody who films yourself singing during concerts, why? I just would like to know why. Because I'm actually like, even though I am being a little bit judgmental, I'm also genuinely curious because it's such a foreign concept to me. But that said, I'm okay. If you want to film yourself singing the entire concert, that's fine. What I was not okay with was this person was screaming to the point I could hear her above my earplugs. And she was like scream singing the whole time. And it's so funny. She was wearing Taylor Swift in her bedroom for You Belong With Me, the like pajamas with like the signed shirt. And so now I have a visceral reaction every time I see that outfit. Like, I automatically hate the person in that outfit, which is not fair of me. Her scream singing was enough to make me feel rage every time I see that outfit. It's so funny what things can kind of like pull you back to certain things you found annoying. But all that said, like I said, the concert was really, really fun, and being in New Orleans and around so many Swifties was also really, really fun and a very unique experience. I don't go to a ton of stadium tours. I cannot speak to all stadium tours, but what I will say about a Taylor Swift stadium tour is the artistry is top notch. The costuming, fabulous. The dancing and choreography, fabulous. Not just all of that as well, but also for me, coming from YouTube, graphics, web, all of that, like being my craft and my trade, I love the artistry and different things she has going on. The graphics and the effects she uses are so top tier, and you can tell she is working with the best and the best, and I think that's truly what makes going to her stadium concerts worth it. Seeing her sing is great. It's really cool. However, all the different ways the stage moves and all the choreography and all the different way things are thought through is so spectacular. And that's what makes it feel really, really cool. For all my critique of how I feel about her as a person, she is very much like not just an artist, but she is a down to the details person in a very intense way. And I think she's an artist in a very intense way, and that's what makes her concerts really cool. That's probably enough of me standing Taylor Swift. That's enough of you seeing clumsy concert footage. We did get the night that Sabrina Carpenter came out, so that was pretty exciting. I had such a fun time at this concert, and I really do encourage people, if you can afford it, go to concerts, go to live music, go to theater productions, go go, even if it's as simple as your like local high school's theater production, like there's just something about live music and live performance that is really worth going to, not just on this big stadium tour Taylor Swift level, but also in your own communities. Like in Seattle, we have a theater called The Rep, and they put on some fantastic productions, and there's also so many different like local burlesque crews that also put on really cool productions. So I just like highly recommend to get out of your comfort zone, get out of your bubble, and go see some live music or theater. I had a great time at this concert, and I'm really glad I went. And that is going to be it for this day in New Orleans. I'm going to be very tired the next day. Speaking of intense Taylor Swift culture, on our way to a tour the next day in the Garden District, my mom and I decided to stop by this, I don't even know what it was, Stony Clover. I didn't go in. I just went to see the decorations. There are just people amassed out here to like take photos, I think, or sing on the porch. I don't totally know what the situation was here. I will say, not my vibe, but it was interesting, and it was, I guess, worth stopping by on the way to where we were going. So the Garden District is a very specific part of New Orleans where a lot of wealthy people live and a lot of celebrity homes are, as well as just really, really cool architecture, with New Orleans being such an old city that also actually preserved its architecture. We started the tour by stopping by another cemetery, which was unfortunately closed. So this is footage I took through the gate, but I would have loved to get in there. I think usually this one is open to the public. I just wonder if around Halloween and Taylor Swift, they didn't want a ton of people in the cemetery. I loved the color of this restaurant. This is apparently the original coloring, like they've kept it up all these years, and I think that's really, really cool. I just also really enjoyed all of the fall decor happening on people's porches, and Halloween decor too. Some of these homes seem wildly ginormous, and I've always loved, this is just generally true, I feel like a lot of places in the South, how much porch they all have. And then of course we still have all that wrought iron, and I love iron sculpture and ironwork. I think it's so cool, and it feels something semi-unique to New Orleans. They just have a ton of it, and I don't know if it's a climate thing or what it is exactly, but I've always found it really cool. And then yeah, they have a lot of also really different types of architecture style in one area, which is not always the case. I love how this one feels like an absolute jungle and has like all that red on it, like they actually painted their fence. And again, just so much beautiful ironwork. This here is Sandra Bullock's home, which is done in the Swiss chalet style, and so now it's making me want to go to Switzerland because this architecture is so cool and so extra, and I love it. And you know, we just have more big mansions with more intense ironwork. They're never ending here. I really liked the gardens in this one. I thought the gardens were really nice. And of course, again, we have great ironwork. This one is one where all the most famous women opera stars would stay when they came through back in the day. He said this one's been under construction for like 13 years, which is wild. If I recall correctly, this one is Anne Rice's house. Anne Rice was actually a pretty despicable woman in my opinion, but I did enjoy her literary works. I just thought whatever was happening with this one was wild, so I had to show you. And this house here was a house constructed out of spite, so nothing makes sense. Apparently, the owner was told once he finished construction he couldn't change anything else in the house by the Historical Society, so he never finished construction and constantly had crews doing things. And then this house here is the American Horror Story house. So if you've seen the show, I believe this is the house it's filmed in, or it's at least the yard it's filmed in, because obviously that gate is very distinctive in that show. And then this one was one of my favorites. It is absolutely stunning. It is apparently a school now. It was supposed to be a school for underprivileged kids, but once it got into the hands of other people, it is now a rich prep kids school. So you know how it goes in America. And then this is the famous corn fence, which is the last thing you're going to see in New Orleans. I don't have another bit of footage to wrap this up with. So yeah, here's some really cool ironwork that you won't see anything like it anywhere else. And the house itself is pretty cool too. I was careful filming because it seemed like the people who lived here were out and about and doing things. But yeah, this raw ironwork is insane. And I feel like a good note to leave New Orleans on. So I am headed home and we're going to jump into the outro. All right, we have wrapped this up. I did go to that fabric store and I have decided that I don't want to do a haul as part of this video. For things that I picked up as souvenirs, I picked up some tea at a tea shop and some stationery, and that's pretty much it. So I don't feel the need to show you guys that. And then for the fabric, I'm just gonna put that in a fabric haul upcoming on this channel. Not enough people watch these videos who do watch fabric hauls, so I'd rather keep that with a fabric haul. As far as final thoughts on New Orleans, I enjoyed my time there so much. I had such a good time. It is heavy on my list for returning to because I do think the experience I got while seeing Taylor Swift was really different from the experience I would get on your day-to-day New Orleans. There was a lot of talk about this on TikTok TikTok and things I was following, but New Orleans actually did put a ton of effort to cleaning up the city for these concerts, including keeping Bourbon Street pretty clean, as well as increased patrols and things like that, which I definitely felt the difference of. Not the patrols, honestly, police don't really particularly make me feel safe, but it was nice to not smell vomit on Bourbon Street, and overall, for being a city in a hot time, it smelled pretty okay. Like, there still were spots that you walked by that smelled, but I have yet to be in a city that is over 80 degrees in a day that doesn't have some sort of smell of hot garbage. New York does, Seattle does, New Orleans does. If people live there, Rome, like literally everywhere I have been to when it gets that hot, the city smells like that. So New Orleans was no exception to that, but also like it wasn't severe. That said, one of the really disappointing things about the cleanup that they did is they actually did a big sweep of homeless people, which it's really common for cities to do these before events, and it's really disappointing. And they end up sweeping encampments, including encampments of people who were just days away from having more permanent housing, and sweeps like that are absolutely unacceptable. They also didn't give notice, which I think is supposed to be illegal. As I know from being semi-active in my local community here in Seattle, they're supposed to always give notice of sweeps, but that doesn't mean they do. One thing on the upside, which this is now coming out way later, but I saw a lot of action, like people on TikTok asking people to like call the mayor and call the governor and say that like sweeping like this isn't okay. And I don't know if it's because of Swifties. I sent some emails. Yeah, like I said, I don't know if it's because of Swifties, but actually a judge put a restraining order on the New Orleans Police Department until November 4th when it came to sweeping people, which that is actually a huge win. If you've ever done any work around sweeps and homeless folks, it's really hard to get a restraining order to stop those sweeps. So that's actually like kind of a big deal, and kudos to the organizers in New Orleans who used TikTok and other avenues to get word out, so that way people made it clear that that is not something that is an acceptable behavior. I did want to acknowledge that I think it's not okay for a city to clean up doing that. Like, yeah, hose down the streets. All of that, like, is going to make a city feel safer, and in my opinion, what made this city feel so safe is it was a city of women. For every man, there were probably like 10 plus women in the area, and I think probably typically one of the things that makes Bourbon Street feel not very safe is the amount of intoxicated men. So I actually think the reason that New Orleans felt so safe is because it was so influxed with women. I'm not saying that women don't do wrong and women aren't never violent or all of that, but I just think in general, and not just think, it is statistically true that men are mostly the cause of violence. I think that's my perspective on why I felt like the city felt safe, and like definitely normally on a New Orleans trip you could not get me near Bourbon Street, and this time I felt totally fine walking down there no matter really the time. I think that's kind of like a cool thing about being in a space so full of women, is it was just kind of fun. Most of my social spaces and a lot of my space are generally very like women or queer friendly, so that's like not necessarily that new to me. It's just I've never been in like a city where I think they said like 150,000 people were here for that series of concerts where everything felt like that, so that was pretty cool. I mean, overall, I just think I would have honestly have preferred to see Taylor Swift when she was in Seattle, but I feel really thankful that I got to see her in New Orleans, mainly because I feel like there was just such like a cultural like thing in the air about it in New Orleans. Like I showed you in the video all of the like so many like all the bars had drink appetizers, whole menus themed around Taylor Swift stuff, and that was just like really fun. It was just kind of wild because like everywhere you saw people wearing Taylor Swift merch. You just saw like it was insane. It was wild. And it was interesting talking to locals there because restaurants and stuff crazy busy. They couldn't keep up with the demand and it seemed stressful. Talking to my Ubers, they said traffic was pretty bad. One Uber driver said it wasn't very busy. I'm just gonna say he was being contrarian because all the other drivers I used said everything was insanely busy, but they all talked about like really being excited about the economics of it for the city because it was coming out of summer where they're really slow in New Orleans. So it sounded like talking to all the different people that it was a really great thing for them to have there. Although I will say talking to some store owners, it seems like things had been slower for them. I will say these were kind of more art gallery or high-end stores, so that's not necessarily shocking. But yeah, it was like I said, a really cool and unique experience, and I'm really glad I went, even though I definitely want to go to New Orleans and experience New Orleans in like a normal time. I will try to get a map made of everywhere I went, but I would say I recommend everywhere I went different. I thought the Pharmacy Museum was spectacular, actually. You never really know when you go to these niche museums. This one was a winner, in my opinion. I did wish I had time to go to the Voodoo Museum there, because the Voodoo Museum there is supposed to actually be very, like, real as well as respectful, which we love, because a lot of times when you're talking about these kind of more fringe religious movements, there's a lot of disrespect around it. So I think it's great that they have a museum there that actually, like, talks about voodoo correctly. So I was bummed that I didn't get to see that. In general, I feel like I saw a lot, but I feel like I didn't see a lot. So that's one of the other driving factors. I'd like to go back to New Orleans. The heat and the humidity there really helps my joints. I hurt less when I'm in spaces like that. And then I will always say Cajun food and Southern food are my favorite foods, like hands down, without question. So I always enjoy that aspect as well. I really have always enjoyed New Orleans. I always think the energy there is really great. I mean, last time I was there, like, full disclaimer, I think I was probably like 12 years old, but I remember having a really good time. And like, there's very few places in my vacation as a kid that I can really remember this kind of like energy of. Yeah, definitely recommend a trip to New Orleans, even though it will not be the same as the Taylor Swift fueled weekend I had. I will say by the end, I was ready to not hear a Taylor Swift or talk about Taylor Swift or see a Taylor Swift t-shirt for a long, long, long time. But it was really fun there in the moment. But with that, I'm just going to wrap this up. As always, I will be back with sewing content again next week. I post every single Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Most of my content is sewing and vintage fashion related. So this is more out of the norm. So if you're new here and that sounds interesting to you, subscribe and stick around. I would love to have you, and I will see y'all next week. Toodaloo!